Codex Alimentarius, why should you care? I chose this topic because it's a question I frequently get when you bring up the subject of Codex. But if you're in agriculture, you do need to care about Codex, and I think Bill has done a good job of explaining how the importance of Codex within agriculture trade. So we'll talk a little bit about why Codex was created, what was its mission, what have we achieved that mission, and what are the challenges ahead. But first, some nomenclature. Codex Alimentarius is the food code. That's the collection of standards and codes of practice and guidelines and risk management recommendations related to food. The Codex Commission is the governing body, the CAC. When Codex was inaugurated in 1963, the trading world at the time lacked harmony. Then there was a desire from regulators and the food industry and others for leadership in harmonizing regulations, food regulations that were impeding trade and providing mostly inadequate consumer protections. Thus, Codex was created with a dual mandate, food safety and trade mandate, to protect the health of consumers and ensure fair practices in the food trade. And there's been a great deal of success. So I just want to go over them. Over the 50-year history of Codex, the organization has produced over 4,000 maximum levels for food additives, over 5,200 maximum residue limits for over 300 pesticides, over 625 MRLs covering 63 veterinary drugs, over 100 MLs covering 18 contaminants in food, and over 150 guidelines, codes of practice, and risk management recommendations. And I should also note, over 200 commodity standards. So that's quite a success story, and it's good news for agriculture that we should not lose sight of. Codex standards and guidelines have helped create a level playing field that provides regulatory consistency and facilitates trade in safe food. In the absence of international food standards, Codex standards, some importing countries establish zero tolerances, which are unnecessary for consumer protection and a roadblock to trade. And as we've just heard, under the SPS agreement, a country that adopts a Codex standard is considered in compliance with the agreement, and that's a big incentive for countries to adopt standards. But there are challenges that are presenting themselves now that may foretell some difficulties for the future. In some instances, Codex is failing to adhere to science and to its procedures, which has opened the door for a minority bloc, the European Union, to try to impose its philosophy and its preferences. We see this in food additives, the Nutrition Committee, food contaminants, but perhaps the most egregious actions are occurring around the MRLs for veterinary drugs. So first, let's have some talk about process. The road to adoption in Codex runs through the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the governing body, which meets annually. But before that, Codex committees initiate, develop, and finalize the standards, and that's where the action occurs. And here are some of the key committees. There are currently 16 active committees, but some of the more important: food hygiene, residues of veterinary drugs in foods, food additives, pesticide residues, contaminants in foods. And the United States hosts and consequently chairs 2 of these, veterinary drugs and food hygiene. And while committee chairs cannot control completely the committee, they do provide important leadership in shaping decisions and reaching consensus. And there's no question that the United States benefits from having these committee chairs. Committee activity can take a few years, nowhere near as long as some people seem to think it does. It's usually somewhere in the 2 to 4 year range that it will take a standard to work through the process. There are some examples of where that doesn't happen. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But the takeaway is, if there's something you're interested, pay very great attention to the committee agenda and get involved in it as soon as the process begins. The foundation of Codex is scientific guidance, and within Codex, the responsibility for providing advice on risk management lies with the Commission and the committees. The responsibility for risk assessment lies primarily with the FAO, WHO, expert bodies. And these are the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, JECFA, which provides advice on veterinary drugs, food additives, food contaminants. Joint Meeting on Pesticide Residues, Joint Expert Meeting on Microbiological Risk Assessment, which provides advice mostly to the Food Hygiene Committee, and Joint Expert Meetings on Nutrition, which generally provides advice to the nutrition committees. These expert committees are convened as needed by the FAO, Food and Ag Organization, and WHO, World Health Organization, and they're made up of scientists from around the world who operate objectively, and they're not representing their individual countries. Thus, their risk assessments are the gold standard, and they take precedence in Codex over any other risk assessment body. And that includes the European Food Safety Agency, EFSA, and any other country, including the United States. The point is that when the EU or other countries oppose a Codex standard based on their own risk assessments, they are discounting the Codex expert advice, and under Codex procedures, these should not be factors in making decisions. Codex operating procedures dictate that consensus rather than voting is the preferred method for adopting standards. There's no definition of consensus, but there is a great deal of guidance on how to reach it. And only rarely does Codex not achieve consensus and needs to take a vote, the most recent being the MRLs for ractopamine in 2012. That issue is indicative of the problems currently occurring in the Vet Drugs Committee, where we've seen serious pushback on science and a rocky road for some MRLs. It's not a new problem. You've just heard about the history of the beef hormones, and perhaps based on that experience, some countries have taken a harder line within the Vet Drugs Committee. And there was a vote in 2012 on the MRL for ractopamine. That was after about 10 years of debate in the committee and at the commission, and after significant efforts to find a consensus. Yet a bloc remained opposed to adoption for, among other reasons, opposition to the use of beta agonists, despite the JECFA report affirming the safety of the compound. The opposition was anchored by the European Union with its 28 member states and its reach throughout the rest of Europe. Every other region supported adoption, some more heavily than others, but the fact remained that one region had the clout by virtue of its numbers to control the Codex action, and a vote was the only way around it. The MRL for RBST continues to be on hold, and work on the MRL for zolpadrol has been slowed down. The debate on zolpadrol took a little different turn. First, in the EU in 2012 tried to block the compound from even being evaluated for safety by the expert committees, arguing that there's no chance of consensus on a beta agonist, and so JECFA would be wasting its time. But even after 3 JECFA evaluations that supported the safety of the compound, the EU has continued to object. And at the most recent Vet Drugs Committee, they acknowledged that they had no disagreement with the JECFA evaluation or the safety of zolpadrol, but they opposed it, they being the European Union, based on animal health issues, which are the purview of OIE, and the use of veterinary drugs for non-therapeutic purposes. At that point, some Codex members really wanted Codex to support its procedures and adopt the MRLs in recognition of the scientific evidence. Codex is reluctant, however, to take such action without trying for consensus and gaining broader support. And that approach is reflected in its rules of procedure. But rather than working to resolve the MRL question, the European Union has managed to manipulate the Codex Commission to possibly open a discussion of the statements of principle concerning the role of science in the decision-making process. That document is, as currently constructed, is the firewall that prevents countries from introducing non-science factors into the decision-making process. The key points are that Codex standards are to be based on science. Other factors may be considered, but they should not affect the scientific basis of the analysis, of the risk analysis. and only factors accepted on a worldwide basis should be taken into account. So consumer preferences in a country or a region are not considered to be accepted worldwide. The United States and others are braced against any effort to open the statements of principle when the Commission meets in July. This would clearly open the door for a country to be able to introduce some of their favorite objections that relate to philosophical biases against beta agonists, against certain food additives, non-therapeutic use of animal drugs, etc. So as these warning signs emerge in Codex, some might say, so what? When Codex fails to adopt a standard, countries lack reference points for food safety standards, which diminishes their ability to export, to monitor imports, and to protect their own consumers. And some veterinary drug manufacturers are abandoning the Codex process, preferring to negotiate import requirements country by country. Where there has been a void, the opportunity for other influences surfaces. These include the EU pushing its own requirements on countries that want to export there, and other standard-setting organizations entering the arena, such as ISO, which is not inclusive and essentially a pay-for-play setup. The net result of all these developments could be a return to the lack of harmonization and to regulatory inconsistencies, the situation that led to the creation of Codex in the first place. It's not that Codex doesn't have procedures that can address these problems. These procedures give primacy to the scientific advice of the Codex expert committees, and they require decisions to be based on factors within the purview of Codex, but enforcing them has proven to be a challenge. This is where the United States and its allies need to work together to demand that the FAO and the WHO support the Codex Secretariat and the committee chairs to enforce procedures and preserve the credibility of Codex. Decisions such as, if all the science questions have been addressed, a standard should be adopted. Codex leadership in the United States comes from the U.S. Codex Office at the Department of Agriculture, but the effort to overturn the direction promoted, this direction that I'm talking about here, will require senior leadership at the political level at USDA, at the Food and Drug Administration, USTR, and others who are stakeholders of FAO and WHO. In conclusion, there is no question that Codex standards have been a great benefit to U.S. agriculture, whether they're commodity standards, guidance on food hygiene and other SPS areas, pesticide MRLs, veterinary drug MRLs. We need to continue on that road, but it will mean removing some of the bumps in the road that threaten both the scientific basis of Codex as well as its ability to continue as the leader for international food standards. Thank you.